Hey everyone, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest. Today I have with me James Dunning. He is the CEO of Syrinix. They are a leak detection company, and we're going to talk all about leak detection today. So, James, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate your time.
Very good to be here too, Bob. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, and especially since we had to coordinate across the pond on this one.
Yeah,
It's nice to
and
do that.
they changed the clocks especially, but just your side. So
Yeah.
you've made it, so it's good.
Yeah, we're all together all at once. That's what really matters, right? So I wanted to talk about leak detection. Obviously, this is a big part of a lot of drinking water facilities and supply side of things. What are the most common reasons that you see a utility is seeking leak detection services? I would imagine this is a pretty simple answer, non-revenue water. But are there other like smaller sub-reasons to that?
You would be surprised actually how many drivers there are, because the thing is, when you get a leak, the utility just gets the water back. So it's had the preparation and energy cost, but the water goes back into the aquifer. And it's amazing how it's changed over the years. So it used to be in England, you had an economic level of leakage, and below that, it was fine. They say if you stopped all the leaks in London, all the trees would die. And so people just accepted it. But what's changed is people are expecting more of their utility now, be that in the UK through regulation, but public pressure, and also in the US, where the utilities are typically locally owned. There's water's more and more of a sort of dinner table conversation, and something that was taken for granted. You hose the lawn and everything, is now actually water's a precious resource, and the planet doesn't seem to be in great shape. So leakage is almost seen as a sign of failure. So leakage is something that all utilities are increasingly needing to get on top of. But then you have risk management. If you have a huge pipe going under an interstate and you've got a leak there, 90% of the time, that's going to turn into a failure that's going to make you very unpopular. In the UK, with the regulation, if you don't fix enough leaks, you get fined effectively. So suddenly, the finance director really cares about leakage, which is something that hasn't happened before. And I think it's all part of utilities and water utilities becoming much more central to how people view the world and what's happening to the sort of resources around the world.
Yeah, that's a good point that like it is becoming more and more a dinner table conversation. I've heard this for years since I've been in the industry, and I've only really been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. That water is the new oil. People just don't know it yet, right? So,
No, I remember when I joined, I heard that, and Goldman Sachs said it was going to be the new oil. And I said to our investors, water's the new oil. And they were like, hooray. But what's been really interesting is going over to the West Coast. I remember my first trip probably 6, 7 years ago, lush lawns, all the sprinklers on it, dawn and everything else. But a green lawn is almost a source of embarrassment now on the
mhm.
West Coast. And it's all about, almost incentivizing, ripping up your garden and putting in sort of low water, and also urban design now about water catchment and reuse and recycling as well. The whole dynamic has changed, and leakage is part of that.
Yeah. So more on the side of the leak detection element here, what are some of the most common technologies that people are using for leak detection? I know there's like quite a few different options that are out there, but what seem to be most common or requested from utilities?
It's well, over here it's the and in the US as well. I was talking to my colleagues about this. What are the technologies? And they said, whatever you do, don't forget the dogs that have been trained to find leaks over in the utilities in England. It's fantastic PR. This very fluffy, gorgeous dog nosing around looking for leaks. But what we've seen is a move from quite blunt methods like step testing, where you close off the valves and then you measure the flow or the minimum nighttime flow. Um, Also, we need to improve leakage. First thing you do is check your meter accuracy and check your billing, and really quite a sort of blunt, high level approach to really very sophisticated survey approaches and also permanent monitoring now. So you'll have on the survey, you have noise loggers, where you'll put teams out with noise loggers to see if they can hear a leak. Now you'll see this deployed in a number of cities. I think San Jose and Oakland have very significant numbers of noise loggers in a mesh across their networks, and then triangulating where the leaks are in the cloud. And then you've got the next stage of that is hydrophone technology, where you're in contact with the water, which means you're much more sensitive and you can have the loggers spaced much further apart. The downside, of course, is you're in contact with the water column for that sensitivity, which means it's more expensive to deploy. And so you find as you get to an increasingly critical pipeline, be it the interstate, or if one that was failed, it's going to cut off half the town, those you'll go for quite sensitive hydrophone-based technologies. And for the others, you'll go for a more sort of a network, as say, of noise loggers. So you get these technologies. You'll still see pictures of people with divining rods. You'll still see the minimum night flow and everything else. And I think, again, thinking ahead of this, our meeting, there's a huge difference between what the most advanced utilities are doing. The East Bay MUDs, WSSCs, Water One in Kansas. Cobb County is a small utility we do a lot of work with, but very, very progressive. But they're really really at the front end, and you've got this huge long tail with this huge bulge of early adopters and late adopters. And we're finding this. We do a lot of work with pressure transients as well. What you find is that the early adopters are all over this, and they want to measure transients because they don't just want to find leaks; they want to stop them occurring in the first place. But then you've got a lot of the vast majority of utilities who are still in reactive mode, who maybe don't have any monitoring, who are maybe thinking, what is a transient? Is that an issue? And it's almost like you've got a two-speed sector, and the front end dominates the conferences and has the most innovative, exciting approaches. But actually, the bulk of the sector is a little way behind. It's not a criticism; it's true of every market. So I think you have got these different stages.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting you bring that up because my follow-up question to this was trying to evaluate the best option for a utility's particular application. And like you said, like based on size and whatnot, like you may not be capable or have the resources to achieve a certain technology use compared
Yep.
to compare based on your size and your resources. So what do you see, like, how do you talk to utilities about determining the best course of action for their particular application?
It's so the water sector innovation are not phrases often used positively, which I actually think is pretty unfair because you have to remember that these utilities are delivering water to hundreds of millions of people, safe water almost all the time, safe water with a few, and then they're taking away that wastewater as well, and they do that every day without you thinking of it. So that is not something that is an ideal test bed for innovation.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that if you say to an operations team, by the way, try this new technology, there's not really any upside to them because they're already busy. They're not sat around thinking, hey, do you want a game of cards? They're really busy. And if it goes wrong, nobody's going to say, hey, well done, because failure breeds success. And we're like in Silicon Valley. They're saying you haven't billed people. The water didn't turn up. You burst some pipes. So there's very few incentives for the day-to-day utility to innovate.
Hmm.
Now, the best example we've seen of overcoming that was actually Anglian Water over in the UK, where they had a small town, Newmarket, lots of horse racing and everything else, but I don't know what the population is, 50,000, say, if that. And they ring fenced it for innovation. And what they did was they had a separate team manage the innovation, assess the innovation, and if it didn't work, said, thank you. But if it did work, they had the test case proven of how that technology will benefit the operations team. And they've also probably weeded out a lot of the problems as well. And when you go to the operations team and say, actually, we've tried this, it does work, it will help you, we want you to use it, give it a go, it's a lot easier. because you're not putting all the risk on the operations team. Um, but it is challenging. It's very
Yeah.
challenging to innovate in the sector, but I think for lots of reasons that are completely fair.
Yeah, that's a good point too. It brings up the whole idea too that like even if it is you say you prove it, right? Now when you bring it to the operations team, you also have to train them. You have to bring them up to speed as well because without the knowledge or understanding of how to even implement it, they won't use it. You know?
Well, but it's even more than that because you're not just saying here's, utilities are organized around installing pipes, operating valves, operating pumps, maintaining that physical asset. A lot of this technology, and we find this, it's data led.
Hmm.
It's saying you haven't got a problem, but if you keep operating that pump or that valve in that way, that pipe that's already 20 years too old is going to fail. And it's desk based, it's data based, it's trend
Hmm.
based, and it's a very different way of working. And it's you almost end up with a culture change program.
Yeah,
And if you,
for sure.
and if you, and people feel threatened about their jobs as well, which is an absolute real concern because it does create new ways of working, and
Hmm.
it's very very challenging. So um, I've worked with lawyers before, and they're pretty difficult. But I think the water sector is as challenging, but I think for very valid reasons. And as I said before, it's only if you ring fence it to protect the innovation do you
Hmm.
actually give space for it to sort of get a bit of a foothold in the utility.
Yeah. So what you were talking about just then was also one of my follow-up questions on asset management, the role that leak detection can play in that as well. Could you talk a little bit about how leak detection can be used for asset management purposes? And like you said, this pipe that's 20 years too old, like it could fail, like how do you use leak detection to help and aid in asset management processes?
So I think there's two aspects to this. I think there's reactive and sort of proactive.
Hmm.
On the reactive side, you do the leakage surveys. If you spot an issue in an area, you can put more surveys out. You can put more noise loggers out. If you have a particularly critical pipe, so Thames Water does this. They have for a lot of their very large critical pipes, they have permanently installed monitors checking those pipes for leaks automatically every day. And if there's an issue, it will tell them exactly where it is. And I think it was research in Australia said that something like 95% of failures on ductile iron start as small leaks. So you have those approaches, but you're still not addressing the underlying cause.
Hmm.
And there's research, I think, done by a chap called Leyshier, and this is also one of the AWWA standards, that if you start reducing your pressures and controlling your pressures, you have a lot of extra pump activity and a lot of extra valve activity. And when you start closing valves and operating pumps, you start sending potentially massive transients through the network, pressure waves. And those pressure waves have a particularly negative effect on corroded pipe.
Hmm.
So if you've got an old network and you're hammering it with pressure transients, you're going to increase your leakage by doing the things that are meant to decrease your leakage.
Hmm.
So, so what's happening is that previously the operations team would just have a target. This is our leakage level. We've got to get it down. You find the more asset management and strategic teams are now looking at how can we change how the network is operated so we can take that stress out of the network.
Hmm.
Having said that, and I think my notes were saying, well, wow, what role does asset management play in leak detection? Now there's a question because because the asset team and the operations team they're each increasingly dependent on the other, but the operations team they run the network, and if I think I was told the story about an operations center, you can give them one incorrect data alarm, but if you give them two and they call out everybody to fix something for a false alarm, they're just not going to look at that alarm at all anymore.
So we had just a quick interruption in the internet connectivity there, but wanted to get to this last question that we had here for you, James, and that was how you see leak detection technology evolving in 2022 and beyond. Where do you think this is going to go? What do you think utilities are going to be asking you for?
So, so if my marketing colleagues were here, I would say it's all about AI and it's all about machine learning. And we're going to have automated leak analysis, sending out work actions for teams to go and find the leaks and everything else. I actually think we're quite a way away from that. There are some technologies that are approaching that. But I think really what we're going to see over the next year or two is quite sort of an iterative process. And I think that's going to have two angles to it. The first is, well, three actually. The first is security, particularly exacerbated by what's gone on in Russia. And I know notices have gone out to the US utilities, I'm sure to the critical infrastructure teams in the UK and elsewhere. IT security is a huge issue. It was anyway, but I think it's become a little bit more real. And I think that's going to potentially slow things up a bit, because the other trend is going to be interoperability. You'll see this in other sectors as well. You get quite a lot of specialism, and the key is that they can work together. And you'll see that you'll have an SCADA system is quite high level, which is fine. But if there's a problem, you need to be able to deep dive into another system. And a few years ago, I mean, you'll know this, you'd always have these SCADA projects. And they're called projects, but they're really a way of life, where you're going to have this single Wizard of Oz source of knowledge behind the curtain with this great platform that will tell you everything about everything. And I'm sure this is grossly unfair, but I've never seen one successfully delivered. Lots of people are doing these projects and everything, but actually delivering them is very, very difficult. And there's almost a move away from that, to having different pots of information, but they need to work together. And I think the opportunities that present and how that conflicts with the need for IT security, I think that's going to be very interesting. But I think the other big change over the next few years is just dealing with the amount of data water utilities are collecting. And I think if AI means being able to manage your data effectively, then yeah, there's lots of AI, but it's not going to be very automated, and it's not going to have its own sort of neural networks. It's just going to be systems and processes for filtering out data that you don't need to look at and allowing users to focus on what matters. Again, you'll see in leakage, there's some solutions talking about prioritization. Other utilities have got their own in-house bots scouring all their different data sources to try and pull them together. And you'll find lots of different approaches and utilities working with other people for different solutions. And gradually it will sort of oscillate down to a standardized approach. But so I don't envisage any great breakthroughs. That, you know, the innovators might do something. You know, you've got the satellites, you've got ground movement detection, everything else. There's lots of really cool stuff. But to move from very traditional leak detection to actually active network management, while still being short of cash, because all utilities are, still being short of resource, because all utilities are, it's a lot of the focus is going to be around data management, and that's where I expect to see the most progress made.
Yeah, and there truly is. It's just a tremendous amount of data for every utility that's out there. And it's only going to get more, like the more we focus on these smart technologies and gathering
Yeah.
this data, the more there's going to be need to be parsed. And to your point on like AI and ML, it's like at least that does a little bit of the legwork for you, but to some degree there still needs to be that human touch probably to make sure that what they're doing is verified, it makes sense, and it just to make sure the decision tree is still coming through someone who has the knowledge and understanding
Right.
of the local system.
Until they retire, and then you and then you lose all that knowledge. And that's going to be the other thing, by having, if you can manage the data and get it in the cloud or wherever, you then the challenges of very experienced people retiring, you can start to manage that more effectively, because he or she retiring isn't a huge loss of experience and data anymore. But that's where I think you'll see the bulk of the utilities starting to engage with technology more. I think AI will disappear, like every sector. The water sector is fantastic at its buzzwords. So it was smart a few years ago, then it's AI and ML and everything. but I think it will. You'll get more adoption of technology, but with more of a focus on just filtering out what you don't need to look at and the prioritization. And I think that's a really interesting bit. I think I remember years ago, when I did my MBA, we were sort of laughing because that's what you do in your 20s at these large companies that hadn't even bought their own IP address. But they do get there. You look at, we were talking about Delta and about British Airways. They have really, really sophisticated web offerings. And it's a bit like the water sector. It may take them a bit of time, but they do get there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where what we'll see, just an evolution as ever in the water sector, an evolution rather than revolution over the next few years.
Yeah, a proliferation of the technologies reaching the people who need it most.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks so much, James. I really appreciate your time today and learning about leak detection and Syrinix and the things you guys are doing. And for everyone who's watching, definitely check out the video description below. We'll have a link from James and Syrinix on some of their leak detection services, so you can check them out. And once more to you, James. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. Are you going to ACE, Bob, this year?
I will be, yes.
Excellent. So we can hopefully meet in person.
Oh, I would love to. That'd be great.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I'll look forward to that very much.